People always say that the truth has a way of coming out, but what they don't tell you is how sweet it tastes when the person who humiliated you gets their comeuppance in real time. I spent years building something, creating something real, and I watched my own family treat me like I was the biggest idiot in the room. They laughed at me. My own daughter looked embarrassed. My sister raised her eyebrows like I was some kind of fossil. But then one day, everything changed. Not because I did anything special. It wasn't some grand revenge scheme or elaborate plan. All I did was sit back and let his own arrogance bury him. That's the beautiful part of this story. I didn't destroy him. He destroyed himself, and I got to watch it happen from the front row. Let me take you back to that day, that exact moment when everything shifted, when he finally got what was coming to him, and when I realized that patience and a good memory were weapons more powerful than anything else I could have thrown at him. I'll never forget the look on everyone's face that moment when his phone buzzed. We were in my dining room, 3 months after that business meeting where everything started falling apart for him. His phone was on the table, and he kept glancing at it nervously throughout dinner. My wife kept shooting him concerned looks. His wife, my daughter, was picking at her food, not saying much. There was tension in the room that evening, the kind you can feel in your bones. Then the buzzing started. 1 buzz, 2 buzzes, 3 in a rapid succession. His hand shook slightly as he reached for it. I watched the colour drain from his face as he read whatever message was coming through. Then another buzz, and another. His jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle working underneath his skin. My brother Lele ooked up from his plate. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah," he said, but his voice was tight. "Just work stuff that apparently needed immediate attention." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping back loudly against the floor. "I need to take this," he muttered, stepping away from the table, but we all heard the first few words of the call. No, that's impossible." He said into the phone, his voice shaking. "Check again, check the numbers again. No, that can't be right. These things don't just vanish." We couldn't hear the response from the other end, but we didn't need to. The look on his face told us everything. Whatever it was bad. Really bad. He walked out onto the porch, phone pressed to his ear, and we sat there in uncomfortable silence, the sound of his muffled voice carrying through the window. I could hear him pacing, could hear the increasing panic in his voice. My wife reached over and squeezed my hand. I wasn't angry, I wasn't gleeful, I was just calm. Because I knew exactly what had happened. 3 months earlier, at that family business meeting, everything had been so different. He'd been riding high, full of confidence and arrogance, convinced that his latest deal was going to make him rich, and more importantly, going to show everyone that he was smarter and sharper than me. That's what this was all about. Not business, not money. It was about proving I was nothing. I need to tell you something about myself first, because you need to understand who I was before all this happened. I'm not a complicated person. I grew up in a working-class neighbourhood, the kind of place where you learned early on that if you wanted something, you had to work for it. My father was a contractor, built houses and commercial buildings across the region. My mother was a nurse. They didn't have much, but what they had, they'd earned. They worked long hours, came home tired, and never complained. They also never asked for handouts or credit that wasn't theirs. They taught me that. They taught me that a person's word meant something, that reputation mattered, and that people who cut corners or lied their way to success never actually succeeded. Not really. They might get rich for a while. They might fool some people, but eventually the house of cards falls apart. Eventually the world figures out they're full of it. I spent 25 years in business myself. Started small, really small. Just me and a business partner working out of a tiny office with mismatched furniture and a coffee maker that was older than both of us. We did consulting work, helping smaller companies streamline their operations, figure out their finances, identify inefficiencies, avoid the mistakes that tank most small businesses. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't flashy. There were no magazine profiles or press releases, but it was solid. We built a reputation. We kept our promises. When we told a client we'd save them money, we saved them money. When we said we'd have a report ready by Friday, we had it ready by Friday. When we told them we'd identify the problem, we identified it. That reputation, that reliability, it became our biggest asset. By the time I sold the business to my partners, we were handling contracts worth millions. We were working with Fortune 500 companies and small startups alike. But more important than the money was the fact that people knew they could trust us. Other business owners would refer their friends to us. Clients would come back to us year after year. That meant something to me. That was real. That was. Then my daughter married him. They met through mutual friends, and when she first brought him home, I could see why she was interested. He was charming, good-looking, and he had this energy about him, like he was always in the middle of something important. He was a deal-maker, always talking about his next project, his next opportunity. He worked in real estate development, and he was good at talking the talk. He could make a vacant lot sound like it was going to be the next big thing. My wife and I attended the wedding 5 years ago. I gave my speech, the usual father of the bride stuff. I welcomed him to the family. I told him to take care of my daughter. I meant it. I really did. The family business meeting happened on a Thursday in October. We were all gathered at my house because we'd been discussing the possibility of creating a family investment fund, something to pool our resources and create long-term wealth for the next generation. My brother was there with his wife. My sister came too. My wife sat at the head of the table, and of course, my daughter and him. We sat around my dining room table with coffee and pastries, and everyone was in a good mood. My sister had made a joke about becoming millionaires. My brother was genuinely excited about pooling resources. My wife was optimistic. It seemed like it was going to be a productive meeting about something that could really benefit everyone. That's when he stood up and announced that he had something to present, something he wanted to bring to the table before we formally established the fund. Everyone was receptive. This was a family discussion after all. We were open to ideas. My daughter smiled encouragingly at him. He pulled out his laptop and started showing us renderings of a commercial development project. High-quality renderings, the kind that cost real money to produce. A mixed-use space, he explained, right in the heart of the downtown area. Retail on the ground floor, office space above, high ceilings, modern design, glass facades. The kind of project that could transform the neighborhood. He showed us financial projections in color-coded spreadsheets, market analysis with graphs and charts, testimonials from potential tenants who were interested in the space. It looked impressive. It looked real. It looked like something that was actually happening. He talked about the location, the demographic data for the area, the demand, the investors already interested. This is going to be one of the big ones. Jess projects in the region, he said with absolute conviction. I've got a lead investor who's very interested, someone with deep pockets who sees the potential. They're ready to commit. They just need to see the final due diligence. He looked directly at me when he said that last part. I don't know why he always feels the need to do that, to make eye contact when he's trying to sell something. I asked him some basic questions. How much capital are you looking to raise? 3.2 million for the first phase, he said without hesitation. Who's the lead investor? He named someone, a person I'd heard of but never met. I made a mental note to look them up later. What's the timeline? We're closing the deal within 3 weeks. I raised my eyebrows at that. 3 weeks seems ambitious, I said. What's your contingency plan if something falls through? He dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand like I was being paranoid. I've done this before. This is my business. I know what I'm doing. You have to understand, real estate development moves fast. Things happen. You close deals or they don't. He was getting defensive. I hadn't even been critical, just asking standard due diligence questions, and he was already in defensive mode. That told me something right there. Then he said something I won't forget. He looked at me, and he was smiling that smile he always gets when he's about to be condescending, that smile that makes my wife reach for my hand under the table. He said, You can't even handle a simple deal. Stay quiet and let the professionals talk. The room went silent. The kind of silence that's so complete you can hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. My wife stiffened beside me. My brother actually coughed, that awkward sound people make when they're deeply uncomfortable. My daughter looked mortified, her face going red. But then my sister let out a laugh like she was trying to break the tension, like she was trying to make it into a joke instead of what it actually was, which was a public humiliation. And suddenly everyone was laughing along with her. But it was the wrong kind of laugh. It was nervous laughter, uncomfortable laughter, the kind that happens when someone has just been put in their place, publicly, in front of their own family. He'd meant to dismiss me, to make me look old and out of touch, to prove that my experience and my knowledge meant nothing compared to his business acumen, and for the moment, it had worked. Everyone was smiling at his joke, even though no one really thought it was funny. He just made a power move, and we all acknowledged it by laughing. We endorsed it with our laughter. We made it okay by playing along. My wife squeezed my hand under the table. I could see the anger in her eyes, the embarrassment. But this was her family too, and she wasn't going to be the one to make a scene. My brother looked away. My sister was still laughing, but it sounded hollow. My daughter couldn't look at me. She was staring at her lap, her face burning with shame because her husband had just humiliated her father in front of everyone. But he didn't care. That wasn't what this was about. He continued with his presentation, talking about the architect, the contractors, the marketing strategy. Everything sounded perfect. He spoke with such confidence, such absolute certainty that this was going to happen, and that it was going to make everyone rich. He even started talking about the next phases, how once this project was successful, he'd have the capital and the track record to take on even bigger developments. He painted this picture of himself as the next big player in the region, the guy who was going to change the landscape of our downtown. By the time he finished, even I was almost believing it. That's how good he was. He could make fiction sound like fact. My brother asked when we'd see the investor. Very soon, he said, once the details are finalised. My sister wanted to know if there were other investors, any backup plans. He said there was interest from several parties, but the lead investor was the committed one, the one with the real money. What about the actual property, I asked. Has the purchase agreement been signed? He hesitated for just a moment. We're close, he said. Very close. The owner's attorney is reviewing the final details, but it's as good as done. I pushed a little harder. Close isn't done. What's the actual timeline? Look, he said, his voice taking on that edge. I've already explained this. You're looking for problems that don't exist. You're just not understanding how this works at this level. There it was. Another subtle dig. At my level, I'm not understanding things at his level. The implication was clear. He operated at a higher level of business than I did. He was the real player. I was just an old consultant who was past his prime. After the meeting ended, people were excited. My brother started talking about how much money they could make. My sister asked me what I thought the timeline really was, and I told her I wasn't sure. Something didn't feel right about it, I said, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. She told me I was being a pessimist, that I should be happy for his success and for the opportunity it presented for all of us. My daughter pulled me aside as everyone was leaving. I'm sorry he was rude to you, she said. He's just stressed about the deal. He's not normally like that. I told her it was fine, but it wasn't fine. It wasn't fine at all. The humiliation had been real, and it had been intentional. Over the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about that meeting. There was something about the way he had presented everything, something about the specific details he'd given and the ones he'd carefully avoided, something about the absolute confidence he displayed when he should have been more cautious, more realistic. In my 25 years of business, I'd learned something fundamental about how deals actually work. The deals that always work out smoothly in the presentation, the ones where everything is perfect and there are no complications, those are the ones that fall apart in reality. Real deals, successful deals, are messy. They have complications. They have obstacles. The people running them know what could go wrong and they're prepared for it. They talk about contingencies. They discuss risks. He hadn't shown any of that. He'd just painted a picture of smooth, inevitable success, which meant either he was an incredible businessman operating at a level I couldn't comprehend, or he didn't actually know what he was talking about, and I'd spent enough time around both types to know which one he probably was. I decided to do what I do best, ask questions. Quietly, carefully, without letting anyone know what I was doing, I started making phone calls. I knew some people in the real estate development, people I'd done consulting work for over the years, people I'd helped solve problems for. I mentioned the project to them, described the location, the mixed-use concept, the timeline, described the investor's name. I asked if they'd heard anything. The response was universal. No one had heard anything about this development. There were no rumours, no whispers, none of the usual chatter that happens in the real estate world when a major project is in the works. That was strange, unusual. Bigger projects like the one he'd described would have people talking. The market would already be pricing it in. Competitors would be watching. That's how this business works. I called my contact at the Commercial Real Estate Association. Have you heard anything about a 3.2 million mixed-use development downtown in our market? I asked. Nothing official, he said. But you know there's been some speculation about that property. I heard something about an investor sniffing around it. Who? I asked. Some guy who claimed to have serious money. But when the developers actually dug into his credentials, they couldn't verify his funding. He had talked a big game, shown some paperwork that looked legitimate, but when it came time to actually prove he could finance the deal, when the time came to put money down, he vanished. No one's heard from him since. That sounded familiar. That sounded like exactly the kind of thing that would happen to someone like him. Then I did something I'm not particularly proud of, but I did it anyway. I called another contact in the banking world, someone I knew well enough to ask a question without the banker getting legally nervous. I asked if she'd heard anything about him seeking financing for development projects. I can't discuss specific clients, she said carefully, which actually told me everything I needed to know. But I can tell you that we've received several inquiries from individuals in the last few months about commercial development financing. Some of them seemed legitimate. Others seemed like they were grasping at straws, like they were desperate to make something work. I got the impression that some people don't really have a plan so much as they have hope and a good presentation. I asked which category he fell into. She couldn't answer directly, but the way she paused told me everything. By the end of that week, I knew. I knew that the project wasn't real, or at least not in the way he'd described it. I knew that the investor was probably a phantom, or if not a phantom, someone who had never committed to anything. I knew that the 3-week timeline was fantasy. I knew that he was either lying about the whole thing, or lying about key parts of it. I didn't know the specific details of what was actually happening, the exact mechanics of how this was all going to fall apart, but I knew enough. And I made a decision. I decided to let it play out. I decided not to warn him, not to expose him, not to go to my daughter and tell her that her husband was full of it. I decided to wait and watch. I decided to be patient, because I knew what was coming. I'd seen this movie before. The confidence, the big talk, the certainty. The person who was so convinced they were smarter than everyone else, they didn't see the walls closing in until they were already trapped. He spent the next 3 weeks acting like he was the most important person in our family. He made phone calls in front of us, always mentioning the project, always talking about the investor, always dropping hints that this was going to be huge. He'd hint at buying a bigger house, maybe a vacation property somewhere warm. He talked about buying my daughter a car, a nice one, something she'd always wanted. He mentioned taking us all on a trip somewhere, maybe Europe, maybe the Caribbean. He was already spending the money in his mind, already living in the reality he'd created. The pictures he was painting were so vivid and so complete that everyone seemed to believe them. My brother was already planning what he'd do with his portion of the profits, talking about finishing his basement, maybe buying a boat. My sister was telling her friends about this amazing opportunity, this family investment that was going to set us all up for life. Only I stayed quiet. Only I asked careful questions when no one else dared to. Only I knew what was coming. For 3 weeks, I watched him milk this thing. I watched him bask in the admiration. I watched him be the smartest guy in the room, the one who'd figured it out, the one who understood how to really make money while the rest of us were stuck in the old ways. That's what his whole presentation had been about, after all. It wasn't just about the deal. It was about proving something. It was about proving that he was better than me, that he understood business at a level I never could. And for 3 weeks, he got to feel that way. He got to have that power. But I could see the cracks forming. Around the end of the 2nd week, the mentions of the project became less frequent. He stopped talking about it at family dinners. He stopped making those public phone calls where he'd casually mention the investor and the closing timeline. The swagger started to diminish. When my daughter asked him how things were progressing, he'd give vague answers. "There's just some paperwork we're working through," he'd say. "Some complications with the title, but nothing we can't handle." His voice didn't have the same confidence anymore. The bravado was slipping. By the 3rd week, he barely mentioned it at all. When I'd ask him casually about the status, he'd give me one-word answers. Fine. Good. Moving forward. But his eyes told a different story. His eyes said he was terrified. I'd seen that look before in business. Seen it on the faces of people who'd promised something they couldn't deliver, who'd talked their way into a corner they couldn't talk their way out of. I knew exactly what was happening. The investor had either never existed or had pulled out. The property deal was falling apart. The whole thing, this grand vision he'd painted for all of us, was collapsing in real time. I said nothing. I didn't offer advice. I didn't ask probing questions, I just waited. Because that's what you do when you know someone is going to fail. You wait. You let them fall. You let them hit the ground. And then, when they're lying there broken and confused, you maybe extend a hand, or maybe you don't. Maybe you just watch. Then came the dinner that Thursday evening, 3 months after the meeting. He'd been quiet the past few weeks, not talking as much about the project, not making those bold predictions. I'd heard through my daughter that there had been some delays, some complications with the property purchase. Nothing serious, he'd told her. Just paperwork stuff, standard business stuff, standard complications. Nothing that would derail anything. But he sounded less confident now. The swagger had diminished to almost nothing. His jaw was constantly clenched. He'd started drinking more in the evenings, losing weight, becoming withdrawn. I could see it written all over his face. This man was in panic mode. He was losing sleep. He was terrified. But he was still trying to hold it together. That's what surprised me the most. Even knowing it was all falling apart, even with all the signs screaming that this was a disaster, he was still trying to act like everything was fine. He still wanted to be the smart guy in the room, the one who had it all figured out, the one who was smarter than me. He was like an actor playing a role, but someone had turned up the lights and the makeup wasn't hiding the cracks anymore. The entire facade was starting to crumble and everyone could see it. Then dinner happened, and then his phone started buzzing, and everything he'd built, everything he'd claimed, everything he'd used to humiliate me in front of my own family, came crashing down in the space of a few seconds. He came back to the table about 5 minutes later, and his face was a completely different colour. Not just pale, not just worried, genuinely terrified. His shirt was soaked with sweat at the collar. His hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. His wife, my daughter, immediately stood up. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern flooding her voice. He didn't answer her. He just stared at his phone like it was a bomb that was about to detonate in his hands. His jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He sat down very slowly, as if the act of sitting required him to think about every single movement. The phone buzzed again, and again, and again. Message after message appearing on the screen, and with each one, I could see him getting smaller, like someone was letting the air out of him. Finally, he unlocked the screen and looked at it. Then he looked up at us, and I watched the moment when it all became real for him. The moment when he understood that this wasn't something he could talk his way out of, that his presentation skills and his confidence and his ability to look you in the eye and lie with absolute conviction weren't going to save him this time. The investor withdrew, he said quietly. All of it. All 3.2 million. He said something came up, a due diligence issue. The property records didn't match what we'd said they were. He pulled out. He's gone. He didn't sound angry. He sounded broken. He sounded like someone who'd just watched their entire reality collapse in real time and couldn't quite process what was happening. My wife reached across the table toward him, a sympathetic gesture, but he pulled his hand away. "Don't," he said. "Just don't." My daughter was confused, but he was so committed. He told you it was a done deal. What due diligence issue? He didn't say. He just said he's not interested, and he's not the only one. The other emails, the messages, they're all pulling out. Everyone who was supposedly on the periphery of this deal, everyone who was supposedly interested, they're all backing away. The contractor sent an email. The architect said he can't move forward without confirmed financing. The property owner's attorney sent a letter saying if we can't close by the deadline, they're putting it back on the market. That deadline is tomorrow. We had one investor, and he just evaporated. There's no backup plan. There's no contingency. There's just nothing. The room was completely silent now. My brother was staring at his plate. My sister looked embarrassed for him, which somehow made it worse. My wife was looking at me, and I could see something in her expression. Not "I told you so." Just a kind of sad understanding that she'd known something was off about this the whole time, but had hoped she was wrong. My daughter sat down very slowly, her face going through a series of emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, disbelief, then anger. "What do you mean there's no backup plan? You said you had investors. You said you had multiple parties interested. You said it was a sure thing." He looked at her, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker across his face. Shame, maybe, or desperation. I didn't know which one was more honest. "I was being optimistic," he said. "The market conditions were right. I believed it was going to work. People in this business, we take risks. We make projections. Sometimes they don't pan out the way we expect. Sometimes a deal looks solid, and then suddenly it's not." My brother finally looked up from his plate. "So what does this mean exactly?" he asked carefully. "It means the development isn't happening," he said flatly. "It means I don't have $3.2 million to present to this family fund. It means I was wrong about the timeline. It means a lot of things I said weren't as certain as I made them sound." That was the closest he came to actually admitting the truth. Not a full confession, not a real apology. Just the bare minimum acknowledgement that he'd been wrong about things. My daughter stood up from the table. She walked into the kitchen without saying anything. I could hear her pouring water from the tap. She needed a moment. She needed to process the fact that the man she'd married had just stood in front of her entire family and presented something that wasn't real. That he'd done so with absolute confidence. That he'd humiliated her father in the process. And now it had all fallen apart. I could see the realization settling on her face when she came back. The humiliation I'd felt in that earlier meeting, when he'd told me to stay quiet, when he'd laughed at me in front of everyone. That humiliation had just transferred itself directly onto her. She was going to have to face her family knowing that she'd brought this person into our lives, that she'd married someone who would do something like this. My sister finally broke the silence. "So what are you going to do now?" she asked him. "I don't know yet," he said. "I need to figure out how to contact the property owner, explain what happened, see if there's any way to salvage this. There probably isn't. But I need to try." My brother asked, "What about our family fund? Are we still doing that? Because if the plan was to include this development, we need to talk about what's actually viable." He nodded slowly, like he was just now realizing the full scope of what he'd done. "I don't think I should be part of this conversation right now," he said. "I don't think I'm in a position to advise anyone on anything financial." He looked at me when he said that. Just for a second. Just long enough for me to understand that he knew exactly what he'd done. He knew exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. He knew exactly how thoroughly he'd failed. But he didn't know yet the full extent of why he'd failed, and that part was important. That part was the part that really mattered. What I'd discovered in those 3 weeks leading up to this dinner wasn't just that the deal was fake. It was worse than that. It was that he'd known it was fake, or at least he knew it was highly questionable. I'd found emails on a borrowed laptop once, emails between him and a property manager discussing the actual condition of the building. The foundation had serious problems. The structural integrity was questionable. The cost to bring it up to code would be in the millions. The numbers he'd presented to us, the numbers he'd been confident about, they didn't account for any of that. They assumed a building that didn't have serious structural problems. They assumed a property that was ready to develop. In reality, the property was a money pit. The inspection reports told the story. Water damage in the basement, mold in the walls, electrical systems that hadn't been updated since the 1970s, plumbing that was corroded and failing. No legitimate investor, no one with real money to lose was going to touch it. That's why his phantom investor had run. That's why the property owner was spooked. That's why everyone was backing away. The deal was impossible from the start. Not just challenging, not just risky, impossible. But I'd also found something else. Something that explained a lot more. Bank statements, credit card statements, loan documents. The man was drowning in debt. Not business debt. Personal debt. He had credit cards maxed out. He had personal loans he couldn't afford. He had cash advances on top of cash advances. He was going to lose his house in about 4 months. He had creditors calling him. He was desperate. He was so desperate that he'd come up with this development project idea, this massive deal that was going to make $3.2 million appear out of nothing. And he'd convinced himself that if he just presented it confidently enough, if he just talked the talk well enough, someone would believe him. Someone would fund it. Someone would make his debt disappear. The whole thing was a fantasy built on desperation. And the humiliation he'd directed at me in that earlier meeting, telling me I couldn't handle a simple deal, staying quiet and letting the professionals talk, that wasn't really about me at all. It was about him. It was about him needing to feel like he was smarter than someone, because the reality of his situation was crushing him. He needed to be the smartest person in the room for just one moment, and I'd been convenient for that purpose. My wife squeezed my hand under the table that evening at dinner, the one where everything fell apart. I could see her trying to figure out what I was thinking. I'd stayed quiet through the whole thing. I hadn't said I told you so. I hadn't made any kind of cutting remark or expressed any kind of satisfaction in his failure. I'd just sat there and watched him unravel. She knew me well enough to understand that my silence wasn't kindness. My silence was restraint. My silence was me deliberately choosing not to say what was actually going through my head, which was a lot of things. but mostly it was a thought that had been forming over the course of those 3 weeks. It was a thought about what it means when someone tries to humiliate you, when someone tries to make you feel small in front of your family, when someone tries to prove they're better than you and smarter than you and more capable than you. It's a thought about what happens when that person then fails so spectacularly that their failure becomes public. What happens to the humiliation then? Does it just disappear? Does it get forgiven because now they're the one who's humiliated? I wasn't sure, but I was going to find out. After dinner, after my family had left and the tension had bled out of the house, after my wife had gone to bed and I was alone with my thoughts, I made a decision. I was going to stop investigating quietly in the background. I was going to stop making phone calls to my contacts and asking careful questions. I was going to stop playing detective from a distance. I was going to actually get involved. Not in a vengeful way, not in a way that was designed to hurt him, but in a way that was honest, in a way that made sure that everyone understood exactly what had happened here and why. Because the thing that bothered me wasn't just that he'd failed, it was that he'd been so willing to lie about it, so willing to present false confidence, so willing to do whatever it took to make himself look awed in front of people. That deserved a response. That deserved to be addressed. I called my contact at the Commercial Real Estate Association again. I asked him if he could give me any more details about the phantom investor that had supposedly been interested in the downtown property. What I was looking for was whether the investor was real or not, and if real, whether there was any legitimate connection to the development deal my son-in-law had been promoting. He was cautious in his response. "I can tell you that the individual in question is known to this market," he said, "and the individual in question has a history of interest without follow-through. That's all I can really say. But if you're asking whether someone invested $3.2 million in a downtown development project in the last few weeks, I can tell you that the answer is definitely no. That's not something that would have happened without the whole market knowing about it." I called my contact in the banking world. I asked if she could tell me anything about someone who'd been trying to get financing for real estate development projects. Again, cautiously, but clearly. "I can tell you that someone did approach us about financing for a property development about 4 weeks ago. They brought documentation that appeared legitimate at first glance, but when we dug into it, the numbers didn't add up. The property assessments they provided had been falsified. The comparables they used didn't match the actual market. When we pressed them for more information, they couldn't provide it. We declined to move forward. That person has not been back. If you're asking whether we funded $3.2 million for any development project, the answer is no. And if you're asking whether I would have, the answer is also no. There were too many red flags. I hired an investigator. Not a private investigator in the legal sense, but someone I knew who'd worked in fraud investigation in the past. I gave him the property address, the investor name, the timeline, and asked him to find out everything he could about what had actually happened. He came back with a report 2 weeks later, a comprehensive document that detailed everything. The property in question was real. It existed. But it was a disaster. The foundation had multiple cracks, some of which went through the load-bearing walls. The roof leaked. The interior was dated and would require a complete renovation. The property had been on the market for 18 months with minimal interest because no one could figure out how to make it work. The asking price was $2.5 million, which meant you'd be buying a structurally compromised building with another $2 to $3 million in needed renovations before it would even be remotely viable. This wasn't an opportunity. This was a liability. No legitimate developer would touch it. The investigator had actually walked through the building himself and taken photographs documenting the problems. The pictures didn't lie. This was a white elephant of a property, something that looked promising from a distance but revealed its true nature the moment you got close enough to examine it. The investor, the person my son-in-law had named as the lead funder, was apparently a real estate speculator who'd made some money in the past, but had also made some spectacular failures. He was known in the market as someone who'd make commitments and then back out. He'd been contacted about this property, or so the investigator believed, but there was no evidence that he'd ever seriously considered it. There was no indication of any commitment. There was no reason to believe he'd ever been planning to fund $3.2 million toward this project. My son-in-law had essentially created a fiction, presented it as fact, and hoped that no one would look too closely at it. I also had the investigator look into my son-in-law's financial situation. This was the part that required some careful maneuvering, legally speaking, but the investigator was experienced and knew how to work within ethical boundaries. What emerged was a picture of someone in serious financial distress. The house was mortgaged beyond its value. The business had no substantial assets. There were judgments against him from creditors. There were multiple debts that had gone into collection, multiple judgments, court orders. His credit score was in the low 500s, which essentially meant he couldn't borrow money legitimately anymore. He was completely cut off from traditional financing. That's why he needed this deal to work so badly. That's why he'd invented an investor. That's why he'd lied about timelines and certainties and due diligence. This man was not the successful real estate developer he'd presented himself as. This man was someone who was drowning and desperately throwing whatever life raft he could find into the water, hoping that someone would believe it was a cruise ship. My daughter called me about a week after the dinner. Her voice was quiet, devastated. "I know what he did," she said. "I had the same investigator look into it. I wanted to know for myself whether what happened at dinner was just a miscalculation or whether he'd actually lied to us deliberately. It was deliberate, Dad. He had to have known. Nobody makes a presentation like that without knowing what they're presenting." She was crying. "I've been married to this person for 5 years. I have a life with him. I have a plan with him. And it's all based on nothing. It's all built on lies." I told her to take her time before making any decisions. I told her that this was a lot to process. I told her that she needed to talk to a lawyer, that she needed to protect herself legally, that she needed to think about what she wanted to do next. She said something to me that I'll never forget. She said, "Dad, the worst part isn't that he lied. It's that I didn't see it. You saw it. You saw it immediately and you didn't say anything. You just let it happen." She was right. I had let it happen. I'd known what was coming, and I'd stayed quiet because I wanted to watch him fail. I wanted to see the humiliation on his face. I wanted to see him understand that confidence without substance, that presentation without reality, that arrogance without competence. None of those things actually work. And in doing that, in choosing to let him fail rather than trying to warn anyone, I'd let my daughter get hurt. I'd let her ride a wave of false hope right up until the moment it crashed. I apologized to her. Not because what he'd done wasn't his fault, it was entirely his fault, but because I'd had the knowledge and the ability to prevent her from getting hurt, and I'd chosen not to use it. I'd chosen to let things play out the way they were going to play out so that I could experience the satisfaction of being right. That satisfaction, as it turned out, came with a cost. A few days after that conversation, there was a knock on my door. It was him. I opened it, and he looked even worse than he had at dinner. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. His face was grey, his eyes were hollow, he'd lost weight. The swagger was completely gone. In its place was something else. Desperation. Genuine, deep, destructive desperation. He looked smaller somehow, like his entire body had folded in on itself. "Can we talk?" he asked. I invited him inside and he sat on my couch and told me everything. The debt, the pressure, the creditors calling, the foreclosure notices, the casino visits that had spiraled into a serious addiction, the fantasy he'd created about the development project because if it worked, if just one person believed him, if just one investor committed, then everything would be okay. He could pay off his debts. He could save his marriage. He could save his house. He could be the person he'd been pretending to be. But it didn't work, and now everything was falling apart. He was facing potential fraud charges if anyone decided to press them. His wife was talking to a lawyer, his house was going to be foreclosed on, his career was over, his business partners had abandoned him, he was alone in it, and it was all his fault. I could have said something cutting at that moment. I could have told him that this was exactly what he deserved. I could have thrown his words back in his face. "You? You can't even handle a simple deal," I could have said. "Stay quiet and let the professionals talk." But I didn't. I just listened. And when he finished, when he'd unloaded everything he'd been carrying, I told him something that surprised us both. I told him that he needed help. Real help. Not from me, not from a family member, from a professional, a therapist, an addiction counsellor, someone who could actually help him address the underlying issues that had led him to make all these choices. I told him that the consequences of what he'd done were going to be real and difficult, but that they weren't permanent if he was willing to do the work. I told him that humiliation, shame, failure, these things don't have to define you forever, but they will if you don't address what caused them. He left my house without saying much of anything. I haven't seen him since that day, My daughter went through with a divorce. It was messy and painful, and it took a toll on her that I'm still not sure she's fully recovered from. But she's rebuilding. She's moving forward. She's learning that sometimes the people we choose to trust don't deserve that trust, and that learning that lesson is difficult but necessary. As for me, I learned something too. I learned that being right about something doesn't mean you have to prove it. I learned that letting someone fail to satisfy your own need for vindication is a choice. And that choice has consequences that extend beyond just the person who fails. I learned that humiliation, whether directed at me or directed at someone else, isn't something to savour. It's something to understand, to acknowledge, and to move past. That line he'd said to me in the meeting, "You can't even handle a simple deal, stay quiet and let the professionals talk." It had stung, it had been meant to sting, but the sting wasn't really about me. It was about him. It was about his need to prove something that he couldn't prove. His need to feel superior to someone in order to mask the fact that he felt inferior to himself. I understood that eventually. It took me a while, but I understood it. And once I understood it, the sting went away. What replaced it was something sadder and more complicated. Sympathy, maybe, or at least understanding. Understanding that everyone fails sometimes. Understanding that everyone makes bad choices sometimes. Understanding that everyone tries to cover up their failures and their bad choices with bluster and confidence and false presentations. The only question is what you do when you're caught. Do you double down? Do you deny? Do you attack? Or do you face it? Do you acknowledge it? Do you try to do better? He didn't do any of those things, not really. He just disappeared. I don't know where he is now or what he's doing. My daughter doesn't talk about him except in therapy. My family has moved on. The business meeting we were supposed to have about the family investment fund never actually happened. We decided not to pursue it. The trust that had been there before, the willingness to combine resources and make plans together, that had been damaged. Not permanently, maybe, but at least for now, we've decided to keep our finances separate. As for that moment when his phone buzzed at dinner, that moment when everything came crashing down, I still think about it sometimes. I think about how quickly a person can go from feeling invincible to feeling completely destroyed. I think about how much of what we present to the world is performance, and how fragile that performance can be when reality decides to intrude. I think about the person that he was trying to be and the person that he actually was, and the distance between those two things. I think about my daughter, and how the person she thought she'd married turned out to be someone else entirely. And I think about myself, and the choice I made to let it all play out rather than trying to stop it. I made that choice because I wanted to be right. Because I wanted to feel vindicated. Because the humiliation of being told that I couldn't handle a simple deal, that I should stay quiet and let the professionals talk, that had hurt my pride and I wanted payback. But payback, as it turned out, isn't as satisfying as you think it's going to be. I made a decision that day, sitting alone in my house after he'd left. I wasn't going to do anything further. I wasn't going to make more calls or dig deeper or orchestrate anything. The investigation had revealed what it revealed. The truth was out there, existing whether I acknowledged it or confronted it or not. What happened next would happen because of choices he'd made, not because of anything I did or didn't do. That was important to me. I needed to know that whatever came next, I hadn't pulled the strings. I'd simply seen the reality of the situation and let it exist. That was different from revenge. That was just honesty. But honesty, as it turned out, was enough. My contact from the Commercial Real Estate Association called me 3 days later. I wasn't expecting to hear from him, but I picked up anyway. "Marcus," he said, "there's something you should probably know. The investor that your son-in-law was working with just contacted a few people in the market, said he'd been doing his own due diligence on that property your son-in-law had been pitching, says he looked into it more carefully and realised the numbers didn't add up. Structural issues, foundation problems. The whole thing was a money pit. He's backing out completely, pulling his commitment, and he's telling everyone else he knows to steer clear of it too." I felt something shift in my chest. Not satisfaction exactly. Not yet, anyway. More like the moment right before an avalanche when you know something's about to fall, but you haven't actually seen it fall yet. Word travels fast in this industry, my contact continued. People are already calling people. The developer's got a problem now. That investor was apparently supposed to be the lead funder for some kind of development project. Without him, the whole thing collapses. I asked him if he knew anything more about what was going to happen. He said he didn't. But he said that the property owner had already sent a letter to the developer saying the deal needed to close by a specific deadline, or they were taking the property back on the market. That deadline, he said, was less than a week away, and without that investor, without that $3.2 million, there was no way that deadline was getting met. I thanked him and hung up. I didn't call anyone else. I didn't tell my wife or my daughter what I knew was coming. I just waited. I knew my son-in-law well enough to understand that he wasn't going to accept this quietly. He wasn't going to process it in private and then calmly announce it to the family. He was going to panic. And in panicking, he was going to do something desperate. And in doing something desperate, he was going to reveal himself in a way that he hadn't before. 3 days later, on a Thursday evening, there was a knock on my door. Not a doorbell ring. A knock. Aggressive. Urgent. Like someone was hitting the door with the heel of their hand. I opened it and there he was, my son-in-law, the real estate developer, the man who told me I couldn't handle a simple deal. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His shirt was wrinkled. His face was covered in stubble. His eyes had this wild, unfocused quality to them, like he was looking past me rather than at me. He didn't say hello. He didn't wait for an invitation. He just pushed past me into the house. "What did you do?" he demanded. "What the hell did you do?" I was confused, or at least I pretended to be. I said, "I haven't done anything." "What are you talking about?" "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice getting louder. "I know you did something." The investor backed out. He called me this morning and said he'd had a change of heart. Decided not to go through with the deal, and the property owner is threatening to cancel everything. The deadline is tomorrow, 48 hours. We're talking about losing a $3.2 million deal because of you. Because you got in someone's ear and told them not to invest. Who did you call? I told him I hadn't called anyone. That was the truth, which made it easier to say. But he didn't believe me. He was too desperate to believe anything. He started pacing around my living room, running his hands through his hair, talking to himself as much as to me. This was going to be my breakthrough, he kept saying. This was going to change everything, and you sabotaged it. You sabotaged me because you never wanted me to succeed. You never wanted me to be better than you. Well, congratulations. Mission accomplished. You won. I watched him fall apart and I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected to feel. What I felt was something sadder. What I felt was the recognition of someone at the absolute end of their rope. Someone who'd built their entire identity on a lie, and now that lie was collapsing and there was no foundation underneath it. "Where is my daughter?" he asked me suddenly. "Is she here?" I said she was at work. I wasn't going to let him near her while he was like this. He tried to push past me toward the hallway, but I stepped in his way. "You need to leave," I said. "Get out of my house. This isn't your house. And I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what you did. I didn't do anything. The investor did. They made their own choice based on their own research. If you can't get the deal done, that's not my problem, and it's certainly not my fault." His face went red. Anger flooded in where desperation had been moments before. "You sanctimonious bastard," he said. "You always acted like you were so much better than everyone else. Like you were smarter. Like you knew everything. Well, let me tell you something. You're not smarter. You're just older. And older isn't the same as wiser. You're just a tired, washed-up guy who thinks that because he spent years as a cop, you know how to read people. You don't know anything. You're just a person who got lucky, and now you're pretending like luck is the same as skill." The words were meant to hurt. They were designed to land in specific places. But I'd already heard these words, or variations of them, directed at me in different contexts by different people throughout my life. You learn when you get older that most insults people hurl at you are really just descriptions of their own fears. They're telling you what they're afraid of, what they think might be true about themselves, but they're attributing it to you so they don't have to look at it directly. He was afraid that he was the washed-up one. He was afraid that luck was all he had, not skill. He was afraid that he wasn't actually as smart as he needed to be. I didn't argue with him. I didn't defend myself. I just looked at him and said, "You need to figure out what comes next." "Honestly," I said, "because the way you're going right now, you're going to destroy everything. Your marriage, your career, your self-respect. You can still come back from this, but only if you stop lying. Only if you acknowledge what actually happened and why." He laughed, but it was a broken sound. "You think I'm the one lying? You think I'm the problem?" he said. "I'm not the problem. People like you are the problem. People who get in the way, people who sabotage other people because they're threatened by them. My daughter asked me once if you were proud of her, and I told her you probably were, but you didn't know how to show it. She asked why I thought that, and I said because people like you don't know how to let other people succeed without it making you feel small. I think she believed me for a while. I think that's what made her question you. That's what made her doubt. But that's not true, is it? You're not threatened by me. You just saw something that didn't add up and you investigated, and you found out the truth. And you're a good enough person that instead of using it to humiliate me like you could have, you just let it sit and waited to see what I would do with the information. But because you're also someone who understands how people work, you couldn't help yourself. You had to know. You had to understand. And now you know. And now you understand. So what are you going to do about it? I didn't have an answer. Or I had an answer, but I wasn't sure I wanted to give it. What I was going to do was nothing. I was going to let the chips fall where they might. I was going to let him experience the consequences of his choices without softening them or easing them or stepping in to help mitigate them. Because the thing about learning lessons, the real learning, the kind that actually sticks, is that you have to feel the full weight of the consequences. I told him to leave my house. He stood there for a moment, like he was considering whether to push further, whether to escalate. But something in my expression must have told him that I was done. I was done listening. I was done engaging. I was done with this entire situation. He left without saying another word. I heard his car start and pull away, tires spinning on the driveway like he was driving without actually thinking about driving, just moving because staying still was unbearable. My wife came out of the bedroom where she'd been, and I could see she'd heard the whole thing. She didn't ask me to explain what that was about. She already knew. She just looked at me with that expression she got sometimes when she knew I was carrying something heavy. She didn't try to make me feel better about it. She just put her hand on my arm and left it there for a moment, and that was enough. The next morning, my wife showed me an article from the local business section. Developer loses major deal, the headline read. The subheading explained that a highly anticipated downtown real estate development project had fallen through after a major investor had withdrawn his commitment. The developer was reportedly scrambling to find alternative financing and had apparently missed the deadline to close on the property. The property owner was now considering putting it back on the market. The article didn't name my son-in-law directly in the online version, but if you read between the lines, it was clear it was him. It was his deal. It was his failure. His wife saw the article too. She called me almost immediately. "I saw the news," she said. "Is this him? Is this the deal he's been talking about?" I didn't answer right away. I just confirmed that yes, it appeared to be the development project he'd been working on. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Why didn't you warn me? Why didn't you tell me this was going to happen?" And I realized that there were probably multiple ways to interpret what she was asking. She might have meant, "Why didn't you warn me that the deal was in trouble, so I could prepare for the fallout in my marriage?" She might have meant, "Why didn't you warn him, so he could avoid this situation?" She might have even meant, "Why didn't you step in and stop him from making whatever choices he'd been making that led to this moment?" All valid questions, all understandable questions, but I couldn't answer them because the answers were complicated. If I'd warned him, he would have known that I knew. He would have known that I'd investigated his finances and looked into his background and made phone calls to verify his story. That knowledge would have changed the dynamic between us. He would have felt violated and defensive, and that would have made everything harder. If I'd stepped in and helped him, I would have been enabling him to avoid the consequences of his own choices, and that would have guaranteed that he continued making similar choices forever, because he'd learned that someone would always bail him out. If I'd warned my daughter, I would have been putting her in an impossible position where she had to choose between believing her husband and believing her father. There was no winning scenario. There was only the scenario where I let things play out naturally and accepted that other people were going to get hurt in the process. That was the hard part. That was the part that kept me up at night. I told my wife that I'd suspected the deal was problematic, but that I didn't have absolute certainty until after the problem had already become public. That was close enough to the truth that I could say it without lying. She seemed to accept that answer, or at least she seemed to accept that it was the answer she was going to get. My daughter called later that afternoon. Her voice was quiet when she asked if I wanted to meet for coffee. I said yes, and we met at a place we both liked, Neutral Ground. She ordered tea and didn't drink it. She ordered a pastry and didn't eat it. She just sat there and looked at me with an expression that was harder to read than it should have been. "You knew," she said finally, "you knew this was going to happen." I asked her why she thought that. "Because my husband said you sabotaged the deal." And then I thought about it, and I realized that if you'd wanted to sabotage the deal, you would have had to know something about it that most people wouldn't know, and you wouldn't have known that unless you'd investigated, and you wouldn't have investigated unless you suspected something was wrong. So yes, you knew. How did you know? I told her the truth. I told her about the financial documents I'd found, the credit reports, the phone calls to my contacts. I told her about the property investigation and what it had revealed. I told her about the investors who'd backed out. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. She took sips of her cold tea occasionally, like she needed something to do with her hands. When I finished, she sat there for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "So you let him hang himself? You could have warned him and you didn't." "That's correct," I said. She was angry. She had every right to be angry. "That wasn't your choice to make," she said. "That was my choice. That was his choice. You decided what was best for both of us, and you made that decision without asking either of us what we wanted." I couldn't argue with that assessment because it was accurate, but I tried to explain that I'd made that choice because I believed the only way she was going to actually understand what her husband was doing was if she saw it for herself. And I believed the only way he was ever going to actually change was if he experienced the full consequences of his choices without someone stepping in to soften the blow. She didn't accept that explanation, but she seemed to understand it. Understanding and accepting are different things. She pushed her untouched pastry away. She said she didn't know what she was going to do about her marriage. She said she needed time to process everything. She needed to figure out who she'd been living with and who he actually was underneath the presentation. She left that meeting without resolving anything, which was probably the right thing to do. Some conversations don't need to be resolved. Sometimes they just need to be had so that both people understand where the other stands. As for my son-in-law, I saw him one more time. It was about 6 weeks after the deal had fallen through. He was going through with a divorce now. My daughter had finally decided that she couldn't stay married to someone who'd lied to her so fundamentally about something so important. He'd gotten an apartment downtown, a small one-bedroom place that was mostly empty except for furniture from a liquidation sale. He called me and asked if I would meet him there. I almost didn't go. I didn't owe him anything. But there was something in his voice when he asked that suggested he needed to have this conversation, and I was curious to know what he wanted to say. He looked worse than he had when he'd come to my house in desperation. He'd lost more weight. His eyes had a flatness to them, like someone had drained the life out of them. Like the person who'd been so confident at that business meeting, so sure of himself, so certain of his own superiority, had been replaced by someone who'd seen behind the curtain of his own delusions and couldn't unsee what was there. He thanked me for coming. We sat on opposite ends of a worn couch and didn't talk for a while. The apartment was so quiet I could hear traffic from the street outside. I could hear the hum of his refrigerator in the kitchen. I could hear his breathing. Finally he said, "I know what I did. I know I lied. I know I made choices that hurt people. I know the deal was impossible from the start, and I tried to make it happen anyway because I was desperate and scared and too proud to admit that I needed help. I thought if I just presented it confidently enough, if I just acted like I knew what I was doing, people would believe me and it would all work out. But that's not how the world works, is it?" I didn't answer because he knew the answer already. He said, "I'm going to get help now. Real help. I'm going to therapy, and I'm joining a group for people who've made really bad decisions and are trying to figure out how to rebuild their lives. I'm going to file for bankruptcy. I'm going to lose the house. I'm going to lose pretty much everything I can lose. But at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror without hating what I see." That was something. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was acknowledgement. It was the beginning of something that might eventually become growth. I told him I was glad to hear it. I meant it. I said that his wife was a good person and that she was going to be okay, but that her being okay was going to have to happen without him in her life for a while, maybe forever. That was something he was going to have to accept. He nodded like he already understood that. Years have passed now since all of this happened. My daughter eventually started dating someone new, and he turned out to be actually decent. He treated her well. He didn't lie to her. He didn't need to be the smartest person in the room at all times. He was just a regular person who liked her and wanted to build a life with her. The kind of person who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. She married him, and they have a child now. My first grandchild. A little girl with my daughter's eyes and her mother's laugh. When my daughter introduced me to her, she took me aside, and she said, "I know now that you were trying to protect me. I know that you made a hard choice because you thought it was the right choice. I don't know if I would make the same choice, but I understand why you did it. And I'm okay now. I'm better than okay. I'm good." That was enough for me. That was the thing I'd been waiting to hear, the one thing that would tell me. My hard choice hadn't been the wrong choice. My son-in-law, the original one, I hear through my daughter that he's doing better. He's sober now. He's employed. He's working a normal job at a normal company doing normal things. He's rebuilt his relationship with my daughter to the point where they can have conversations without anger. They're not close. They'll probably never be close, but they're respectful, they're civil, and sometimes that's all you can ask for. As for me, I learned something that took me a long time to fully integrate into my understanding of how the world works. I learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is step back and let reality happen. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is not protect people from the consequences of their own choices, even when you love them, even when it hurts you to watch them experience those consequences. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is let people fail. Because failure, real failure, the kind where you actually feel the weight of your mistakes, that's the only thing that actually changes people. That's the only thing that actually teaches. Everything else is just someone else's story overlaid on top of your own story, and you can never really learn from someone else's story the way you learn from your own. The line he'd said to me at that first meeting, "You can't even handle a simple deal, stay quiet and let the professionals talk." It had hurt at the time, it had felt like humiliation, but looking back on it now, I realized that the real humiliation wasn't mine, it was his. It was always his. He was the one who needed to make himself look good by making me look small. I just needed to be myself. That was enough. That was always enough. I didn't need to prove anything or defend anything or explain anything. I just needed to wait and let the truth reveal itself, because it always does eventually. That's the one thing I'm certain about. The truth always reveals itself. Sometimes it takes longer than we'd like. Sometimes it takes longer than feels bearable. But eventually everything comes to light, and when it does, you have to be the kind of person who can look at it without flinching. You have to be strong enough to see reality as it is, not as you wished it would be. That's the only real kind of strength there is. There's a temptation to feel victorious when someone who's wronged you faces consequences. There's a temptation to say, "I told you so," to revel in being right, to enjoy watching them suffer the way you suffered when they humiliated you. But that temptation is a trap, because if you give in to it, if you let yourself enjoy their pain, then you've let them change you. You've let their actions change who you are and who you become. You're defining yourself in relation to them instead of in relation to yourself. And that's where real defeat lives. Not in being humiliated, but in letting that humiliation change your character. I didn't want to be someone who savoured other people's suffering. I didn't want to be someone who let pride and wounded feelings dictate my actions. I wanted to be the kind of person who could see what happened, understand what it meant, and then move forward without bitterness. That's what matters in the end. Not revenge, not vindication, but integrity. That's what lasts.